This video about the movie Gladiator and gladiators and gladiator types comes to you courtesy of the Great Courses Plus, which means that we're free of other adverts, but I'll talk to you more about the Great Courses Plus a bit later in this video. Strength and honour! Matt Easton here of Scholar Gladiatoria, and today we're going to be looking at gladiators, specifically the types of gladiators, the groupings of gladiators, the type of equipment they had, but also specifically how the movie Gladiator starring Russel Crowe got it all wrong. So inspired by a course that I've actually been looking at on the Great Courses Plus, I went back and rewatched the movie Gladiator, and this is a movie which I really loved when I saw it when it first came out in the cinema. I fully accepted that there were historical inaccuracies in it. I didn't necessarily realise how many there were at the first time when I saw it in the cinema, but later on I found out, and we'll talk about those in a second. But one thing that has irked me over the years, and particularly when I started to work on a BBC production to do with gladiator training, I started to realise just how wrong that movie had got it. Now, leaving aside the bigger issue of how the emperors behaved and what they did and the actual sort of main bits of history in it and the bits of fiction, to put the shield down here, there is a more specific topic that we can look at, and that is the matter of the gladiators themselves. Now, many of you will know there are some really good videos out there on YouTube about the subject of gladiators, and many people who are more specialists in the subject than me have covered this, so I don't want to just retread old ground. But in reference to the movie Gladiator specifically, they got some things really fundamentally wrong. And the two main things that I want to focus on here are, number one, the fact that the idea that gladiators just went into the ring and fought to the death and that was it. One person lived, one person died, and that was the end of it. And this is a complete and utter nonsense. When we actually look at the history of gladiators, we know for a fact that most gladiators are fought multiple times. They maybe sustained injury, but they were highly trained and expensive entertainers. They were there to put on a show. Now, yes, it was a very bloody and very dangerous show, and yes, people did die, and certain spectacles that were put on were intended for people to die, sometimes in great big numbers. But generally speaking, the typical trained gladiators of the types that we're going to look at in a little bit later in this video were highly trained, highly expensive, and you wanted to get lots of fights out of them, quite simply. And some of these gladiators, I'm sure anybody watching this video will know, went on to become great celebrities. There were famous Retiarius, famous Secutors, and so on and so forth. So you wanted them to survive, and they were well looked after, they were well housed, they were well fed, and they were well medically treated when they were injured. So one thing that the movie really gets completely wrong is this idea that these gladiators were throwaway slaves that you literally threw into an arena, half of them died, didn't matter, you just get a bunch more slaves from somewhere else. It didn't work like that. These were people who were invested in and looked after, almost like racehorses or something like that. Now, leaving that point aside, there is a bigger point, and it's the one I want to focus on in this video, that really irks me about the representation of gladiators in the movie Gladiator. Now, bearing in mind that yes, this is a fictionalized story, however, it is a movie called Gladiator, and it is a movie about gladiatorial combat and gladiatorial games and the life of a gladiator. And therefore I feel that they should have got a little bit closer to actually what gladiators were. Now, one thing we have to accept from the absolute onset is that gladiators, for the most part, not 100%, but for the most part, fit into certain types of class, we should say, or classifications, or types of gladiator. And gladiators were specifically trained as those types, and specific types of gladiator fought against specific other types of gladiator. So what were these types of gladiator, and which of them fought against each other? Well, before I go into that, I just want to take a little bit of time out to talk about the Great Courses Plus. I think they're going to be single-handedly responsible for me making videos on a whole raft of new topics. Below this video in the description you'll see a link to a free trial with the Great Courses Plus, and I urge you go and check it out, because I think your mind will be blown by how much they've got on there. There are over 11,000 lectures on there. Everything from kind of like economics to various types of hobbies and crafts to zoology, safaris. And the people giving these presentations are absolute top level experts in their field, and there's lots of them. There's people from National Geographic, from Ivy League top universities. So the first course I started watching is called A Historian Goes to the Movies, and part one is a Gladiator Fact versus Fiction by Professor Aldrett of the University of Wisconsin. But it's what inspired this video, and he does touch on the gladiatorial armour and the way that the gladiators are represented in there, but he doesn't go into a lot of depth on that, so that's basically why I thought I would go into depth in this video. But what's amazing is he really he does a summary of everything that is right and wrong historically about that movie. So there are a couple of other courses that I really want to look at. One of the things I want to watch next actually is about the Pirate Wars of 1718, which is on there, and there's another one about the Mongol Empire. Absolutely phenomenal for me, because it means I can brush up or expand my areas of historical knowledge, some of which will definitely filter through to you watching this channel. So do go and check it out yourself. It's free trial, so nothing to lose. It's absolutely awesome. I don't think you'll be disappointed. There's the link below. If you go and visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/Scholar Gladiatoria, okay, and the link's there below, so you can click on that as well. And as I say, you can watch all of those things, basically stream them, or you can download them, watch them later like podcasts. So thanks for your patience, check that out, and now let's get back to the video and have a little look about gladiator types and the movie Gladiator and what they got wrong. I'm not going to go through all of the types of gladiator, but we're going to have a look at some of the main types of gladiator and see how they match together. And I just want to emphasize that one of the main problems I have with the movie Gladiator is the fact that they didn't represent this at all, and yet it's so fundamentally important to gladiators and understanding what gladiators were and how they operated. Incidentally, before I just go into describing the most common types of gladiator that would have been around at the time that the movie Gladiator is set, I want to just mention that the fact that gladiatorial combats came out of funeral rites originally. And from the earliest stages, it does seem that the sword and the shield, or scutum, do seem to have been a predominant pairing in the gladiatorial combats. Now, that's not obviously to say that all gladiators use a sword and a shield, as we'll see in a minute, they don't. But however, there are various types of gladiator that do indeed have a sword and a shield. And generally speaking, the shields are usually a variation on the Roman army shield. And the sword is usually a gladius, although we have to say, looking at the iconography, looking at the sculpture and the figurines and the art, mosaics and things like this, it does appear that gladiatorial swords were probably smaller on average than military swords, but they were a form of gladius, or at least a large pugio or dagger. As well as that, I don't want you to be overwhelmed by the differences between the different types of gladiator, because there are some unifying features between them. Generally speaking, there is usually a manica or arm guard worn, usually of padding, linen padding, perhaps stuffed with wool, combined with either leather or sometimes metal plates, be they bronze or iron, over the top. And there are different types of manica at different periods and different places, and used by different gladiators, but there is a tendency for the hand and arm, particularly when a sword is used, and indeed when the trident is used by the Retiarius, which we'll see in a bit, there is a tendency to protect the lead arm or weapon arm. Now that does tie in also with the fact that the legs are usually protected. People with large shields tend to have their front leg, which would be their left leg, assuming they're holding the shield in the left hand. So if you're holding the shield in the left hand, you're usually left foot forward. And the left leg is usually protected by, again, padding, a bit like on the arm, linen and perhaps wool padding, and then very often a greave made of bronze, usually over the top of that. in some cases where someone has a smaller shield than the big scutum, when they have a shorter version of the shield, or they have a round shield like the Hoplomachus, then we sometimes find, or indeed if we look at the people who've got two weapons instead of having a shield, then we often see that there are two leg protectors worn. So there's a sort of balancing here, and there's also a very strong attempt, very clearly, to increase the odds of a combat going on for longer. And this is of course coupled with the use of the large helmets. So the use of helmets which protect the head and to some degree the neck and the throat, the use obviously of the defensive shield, but the use of armour, particularly for the weapon arm, which is the most vulnerable part of a person's body when they're using weapons, and the use of leg protection, where only one is needed because the person's keeping a big shield in front of them, or if they have a smaller shield and they're more likely to be using passing footwork and sometimes the right leg might come forwards, then they also have a right leg guard as well. So despite the fact that we have different classes or types of gladiator, those are sort of unifying features between most, if not all, most of them. So what are these main types that I want to focus on? Well, these are the types that we see very often in the iconography. We see in textual sources mentioned too. We see them in mosaics, we see them in little figurines, bronze figurines, we see them in statues and funeral carvings and things like this, and they are very often referred to. These are the common predominant types that a movie like Gladiator should have made sure were represented, and represented reasonably accurately, I think, to give a context. Even if you then had character gladiators who were outside of those types or did other things, at least as a background, as a historical background, to show what the typical and the most common types of gladiator fighting at that time were. So first up we have the Provocator. Now the Provocator in the earlier period seems to have been almost equipped like a light infantryman from the Roman army, with a small breastplate, a Roman shield scutum, a gladius being their main weapon, and a helmet which was modelled after the legionary's own helmet. As we go a little bit later in time, the helmet became more protective and became more like almost a merging of a couple of other types of gladiators' helmets. However, the Provocator stayed present and stayed fairly common, and we have a helmet from the Provocator from the excavations at Pompeii, for example, and it's clear that the Provocator pretty much always, perhaps 100% always, as far as we can tell, fought only against another Provocator. And in that sense, it's my opinion that the Provocator almost represents the Roman soldier training or fighting against the other Roman soldier. And I think perhaps there's a possibility that in some sense the training, we know that the training of gladiators influenced the training of Roman soldiers, and possibly the training of Roman soldiers influenced the training of gladiators, and I think they're inextricably linked. And I think that there's a good chance, based on the equipment and what they looked like, I think there's a good chance that the Provocator was basically supposed to represent the Roman infantryman training with another Roman infantryman. Next up we have four gladiators who fight in specific pairings, who many of you will be very, very familiar with. Many of us get taught these things at school even, and you will have seen them in other movies and TV shows. They are the Thrax or Thracian, the Murmillo, the Retiarius, and the Secutor. Now, these four gladiators usually fought in pairs against each other. The Thracian or Thrax usually fought against a Murmillo. The Retiarius usually fought against a Secutor. Now, it's interesting because of these two pairings, if we call them that, the Thrax and the Murmillo are not so different. The Murmillo is more heavily equipped, with heavier and bigger equipment, with a straight sword, and the Thracian or Thrax is armed with the Sica or curved sword, a little bit similar to weapons we find in Dacia, the falx, and a smaller shield, and is a bit more lightly equipped. And also there's a tendency, it's very important to point out, there is a tendency for certain physical types and certain characters to be recruited into certain gladiator types. And we know that one person, for example, might be declared to be perfect to be a Murmillo, might be a big, strong person who is perhaps more defensive. but very kind of steadfast and big and strong, and then they might deem that person to be perfect as a mermnilo because they're more suited to wearing that equipment and fighting in that way. And so they absolutely specialized in that equipment, that armor, and fighting that role. And to a degree it's almost like role-playing in a way, and there was a degree of role-playing in these roles. For example, we know that if we go to the Retiarius, for example, with the alluding to the net, we know that the Momilo and the Secutor had a sort of affinity with the sea and with fishes and things like this. So there are certain other sort of myths and legends alluded to in the characters of these gladiators. In terms of the Retiarius versus the Secutor, they're very, very different to each other. The Retiarius has really practically no defences at all, except for a manica on the left arm and a large protective pauldron on the top of the left shoulder. The reason it's on the left hand side is because people holding pole weapons such as the trident, if you hold it two-handed, you pretty much usually with a thrusting weapon you tend to hold it left hand forward. So against an opponent you'd be left foot forward, left arm forward, and so this side is the side that is vulnerable. Also, they have the very large pauldron, perhaps to compensate for the fact that they don't have a helmet. Not having a helmet means you can breathe and see more easily, but of course it means your head doesn't have any form of protection whatsoever, so one blow to the head and you could be out of the fight. So no questions, the Retiarius is on balance one of the most lightly equipped or lightly armoured of all of the gladiator types that we commonly see. But with this protection on the left hand side, they can to some degree hide themselves behind that. And then of course they've got the net which as far as we can tell from the sources very often had weights attached to it. This of course was to be either thrown around or over an opponent. It could be entangle their limbs, their arms or their legs. It could be thrown over their helmet and used to pull their helmet, although we'll talk about the Secutor helmet in a second. It could of course be thrown over to tangle a shield or a weapon, to tangle those things up, perhaps even disarm them, pull them away from the opponent. So it could be used in a number of different ways. But equally, from the iconography, we know that the Retiarius, often their net was expended and used and it didn't achieve a fight-ending result, and they had to fight with just their trident, and they did have a pugio usually as well, although it's not always shown in the iconography. It does seem that at least maybe all the time, but certainly some of the time, they also had a pugio for point-blank range for close-up combat as well. Now, in terms of the Secutor, in some ways the Secutor looks a little bit like the Thrax and a little bit like the Mamilo. It's got a very protective helmet, it's got a large shield, got a sword. But one of the interesting things is that the shield and the helmet are given rounded edges. And this, of course, is to give them some advantages or defences against the net and some advantages fighting against the Retiarius. So it's more difficult for the net to snag those things. We can even guess that perhaps in the early stages the rounded edges weren't present, and they found that the net too often got tangled up on the Secutor's helmet or shield, possibly. But anyway, with time they ended up being specialised. The Secutor was specialised for fighting against the Retiarius. Now, whilst the Secutor has a very protective helmet, completely encases the head and protects the neck, at least from sort of downwards blows and stabs, it only has two small eye holes, and it is a relatively heavy helmet. We have surviving helmets from Pompeii and elsewhere, and we have iconography of them all over the place. And these are very all-encompassing and encasing helmets. And looking through these small eye holes, and not for the most of the time having any other breathing except for a little gap in the bottom, and the air can come out the front, you get a build-up of carbon dioxide in there, and quite simply, you're losing some vision, you're getting tunnel vision, you're certainly losing the ability to breathe easily, imagine in hot weather whilst you're fighting, and you also lose some senses in terms of sound as well. And remember that when you're wearing a helmet, if you get hit on the helmet, it makes a loud clang inside. Even if you've got padding inside, you still get a loud bang inside. So it really kind of limits the senses and potentially the stamina when we come to breathing as well. So in one sense you might look at the Retiarius and think, well, the Retiarius is very lightly equipped. That seems almost suicidal. But remember, to some extent they can move around more freely, and all gladiators have pretty much uncovered midriffs, unless they're a specific class that has body armour, and there were a few, but we'll deal with them another time. But for the most part, most gladiators were still vulnerable on quite a lot of their body. So the Secutor does have this fantastic armour on the head and a large shield, but the Retiarius is more mobile, can see and hear and breathe more easily. And remember, that trident is a pole weapon. And as I often talk about in my videos, having a reach and leverage advantage and having two hands on a weapon gives you a lot of advantages. Not only can you attack the Secutor from a distance whereby the Secutor can't reach you. Yes, they can defend with their shield. They've got a very large shield. I'm not saying it's easy to get around that shield with the trident, but you do at least have the ability to attack quite freely with that trident, and at a distance where they can't directly attack you back except for charging you down under the cover of their shield. And of course you can switch sides with it, although that would have the disadvantage for the Retiarius that they don't have armour on the right hand side usually. So I think it's an interesting pairing. Now the point to emphasise here is that we've got Thrax versus Mamilo, then we've got Retiarius versus Secutor. Now what I think is interesting is there is a difference between the Thrax and the Mamilo, but in the grand scheme of things they're relatively similar. The Thrax is a bit like a slightly lighter, slightly different equipped version of the Mamilo. They're not hugely imbalanced or hugely different types. So that's more of an even fight. It wouldn't look drastically different to a fight between two Provocators. However, the Retiarius versus the Secutor is a very different fight. It's apples and oranges. And so I think it's interesting that these principal four give you a sort of equal fight and then a very unequal fight. Not saying that one is unequal in terms of strength and weakness, but in terms of how they would have to fight and what their strengths and weaknesses are. Now there is another very important type of gladiator, a very popular type of gladiator we see in a lot of art, a lot of iconography, who is called the Hoplomachus. Now the Hoplomachus is a very, very interesting gladiator and different to the principal four we've just talked about, in the sense that the Hoplomachus was very often paired against the Mamilo and very often paired against the Thrax or Thracian. The principal armament of the Hoplomachus was a spear and a shield. Now there is some suggestion that the Hoplomachus was supposed to represent a Greek or perhaps an older, more ancient Roman soldier, so where the principal weapon was still the spear instead of the sword, and the principal shield was the round shield instead of the later rectangular characteristic Roman scutum. So, but whatever the origin of the Hoplomachus was, they were used a lot against the Mamilo and against the Thrax. They used a round shield. It could sometimes probably have been smaller than this and more like a buckler, like a medieval buckler. It seems to have varied different times and in different artwork. And the spear wouldn't have looked exactly like this. This was the first one I had to hand. This is a later period winged spear. It would have been longer than this. It would have been probably around 7 or 8 feet long, and it would have a simple and smaller leaf-shaped spearhead on it. So this is obviously a very different pairing, and it's the combination of the spear and shield historically is just about the most common weapon pairing for close combat that we find across cultures, across continents, across the centuries. And so spear and shield was incredibly common and popular and used by a lot of the people who the Romans fought against, whether they were fighting in Britannia, they were fighting in Gaul, fighting in what's now Germany, or in Africa, in the Middle East. They would have encountered people using a spear and a shield as their primary weapons. Whereas the Romans themselves, of course, were more, by this point, with the exception of certain types of troops, most of the Roman legionaries were more equipped with the rectangular shield and the sword. So in a sense, we could almost see the Hoplomachus as representing foreign or the common types of soldier that they would encounter on the battlefield, whereas things like the Secutor and the Murmillo were essentially equipped with armament that was more similar, and of course the Provocator, more similar to the Roman legionary. Now, one thing I should say also is that the Hoplomachus, and pretty much anyone with a shield who can afford it in history, also has a backup weapon, and that would have usually been either a gladius or some form of short sword, or indeed a pugio, a dagger. And that is for the principal reason that with a spear, whilst the spear is very good at ranged fighting and has an advantage over a sword, if the swordsman manages to close in, then the spearman, certainly at shield-to-shield range, almost grappling kind of wrestling range, needs a shorter weapon. And so they need really a dagger or a sword that they can deploy, drop the spear and deploy that in that distance. And that's what the Hoplomachus normally had. There are some reconstructions which show the shield being held in the same hand as the dagger. And I think it's, or the sword, and I think it's a little bit fanciful to suggest that they tried to use the dagger or the sword at the same time as the shield offensively, although it's not impossible. And we know that this was done, it's mentioned many centuries later, being done by Highlanders, where they're using the Highland dirk and the Taj, for example. So it's not impossible. My personal opinion is probably, for the most part, it just meant that they could get this backup weapon more quickly if they needed to. So it doesn't impede your use of the shield at all, although you have to watch out that you don't stab yourself in your own leg or thigh or body with the pointy end of your dagger or sword that you're holding. But most importantly, it does mean if someone charges in and bashes your spear point out of the way and comes into shield to shield range, it means you can quickly get your sword out and use it. So these are what I consider the principal 5 types of gladiator who fight against other humans. I'm not going to deal with gladiators who fight against animals or hunt animals in this video. They are the Thrax or Thracian versus the Murmillo, the Retiarius versus the Secutor, and then there's the Hoplomachus, who can fight either the Murmillo or the Thracian. But of course, as has been covered in other people's videos and in some very, very good books, there are many other types of gladiator out there. And it's almost complicated by the fact that sometimes gladiators weren't always referred to by the same name. So sometimes we think there might be 2 separate types of gladiator, and they're actually just 2 names for the same thing. Equally, sometimes there are gladiators referred to and we don't really know, because it may only be 1 or 2 sources that refer to them. We don't really know what they're referring to. And we have to always reiterate and emphasize in videos like this and in books on this subject, you have to emphasize that our source material for gladiators in the Roman world isn't huge. We don't have a huge amount of source material to go on, so we're constantly learning new things, and the excavations at Pompeii have taught us a lot more. But every time a new sculpture or figurine is discovered, it teaches us a little bit more about gladiatorial equipment, and even things like how they stand with the sword and shield, their stances. And sometimes we find exceptions. You know, you find a type of gladiator with a type of helmet that they don't usually have, or a pairing that you don't normally find between 2 different types of gladiator that isn't common. So every time we discover an exception, it widens our interpretations a little bit. So let's bring this back to the movie by Ridley Scott and starring Russel Crowe, Gladiator. And how did they get the gladiator types so wrong? Well, fundamentally, what they seem to have done is they seem to have cherry-picked a few bits of period gladiator equipment, particularly certain types of helmet that we see, some that appear to be more like Thrax helmets, some that appear to be more like Murmillo helmets. Perhaps there's something a little bit like a Secutor helmet in there. And then we see other bits of familiar historical, at least quite similar to historical versions of the gladiator armour. For example, the manica we see worn by various different gladiators in the movie, particularly in the earlier fights. And then we see the leg guards as well, and we see the loincloths and the belts. This is something which is quite characteristic of gladiatorial equipment. So we do see those things, but they're put together in combinations that, as far as we know, they weren't ever put together in, or at least almost never put together in. And so I think they've missed a trick really, because what they've done is they've got access to some of the correct looking gladiatorial equipment, helmets, manica, leg guards, and the weapons. We see tridents, gladius, we see various types of correct shields, and in fact the shields are actually probably one of the most historically correct parts in the whole movie. But they've got access to some of the correct equipment, but they put it together in the wrong combinations. And perhaps more importantly, they have shown group combats which these types of gladiators didn't take part in. Now I have to say, and I have to concede, we do know that at the Colosseum they did hold reenactments, essentially, bloody reenactments of battles. And obviously one of the set piece and most memorable fights from the whole of the Gladiator movie is this so-called Battle of Carthage, the fictional Battle of Carthage, which is actually based on a real battle, and I recommend you go and have a look on the Great Courses Plus on my recommended course. But whilst they have recreated that battle, they've kind of got the equipment, if they're sort of reenacting what these two forces may have looked like, even in a fictionalized account, they've kind of got it the wrong way around, because they've got Russel Crowe's so-called barbarians wearing, the Carthaginians wearing something that is more like Roman equipment, and then they are facing chariots, something that the Romans never really used in warfare. And the chariots were used by various people that the Romans did fight against, but not by the Romans themselves. So it's a sort of bizarre switch around. But, you know, I'm not going to say that that never happened in history. Who knows? It was all about the spectacle, and I do accept that, and I do accept that they did do recreations of battles. And in those recreations of battles, it's almost certain that people wore a mixture of military equipment to represent the nations that they were representing in that battle. However, what they absolutely don't do, and what they completely fail to do, is at any point, even from the earliest combats in the Gladiator movie, right the way through the big set piece battle and all of that period in the middle, and right the way through to the end of the movie, where Russel Crowe is fighting a champion and then fighting the emperor, at no point do they ever really show the famous gladiator types wearing the correct combination of equipment and fighting in the correct pairings that they should have done. And for a movie called Gladiator, about gladiators, I find that incredibly disappointing. And the problem is, it's not even a problem that's isolated to this movie, because so many producers of TV series and movies that come after that will now go, we want to make a show about gladiators, and instead of looking at history, they will look at the movie Gladiator and replicate it. And we see this time and time again with things like Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings. If a particular style of armour or style of sword or style of shield is used in a successful movie or TV series, it gets copied by later ones. And that is how I think it's one of the main reasons, how we came to have this black leather look that pervades everything from the Three Musketeers to Lord of the Rings to Gladiator. This black, shiny black leather as armour, which, you know, is not something that was ever, shiny black leather was never really used much as armour at all. You know, armour was used as armour, is something that we see across genre, from fantasy to ancient world to medieval world. And it's very, very pervasive. So I think that when you have a movie called Gladiator about gladiators, but you don't show the famous main types of gladiators fighting in the way that they fought in the correct pairings, then you've failed. So to conclude, I think it's really a shame that the movie Gladiator missed a trick in showing these very famous and iconic types of gladiator that we know a relatively large amount, certainly compared to the other exceptions to the rules, should we say. We should have at least seen a Thrax fighting against a Mamilo, we should have seen a Retiarius fighting against a Secutor, and hopefully a Hoplomachus fighting against either a Thrax or a Murmillo. And if we got to see a Cisor or one of the other famous types of gladiator out there, that would have been great as well. The Cisor, incidentally, seems to have been an alternative to the Secutor and wore a similar helmet and fought against the Retiarius. But we don't see any of these in the movie Gladiator. There is so much cool about gladiators, and the fact that we've got them using these characteristic Roman shields of sometimes smaller versions than the full army size, and various types of the iconic gladius, perhaps sometimes shorter versions than this, and the pugio, and indeed the sica, the curved or crooked sword, and then the Hoplomachus with their characteristic round shield and spear. And they're just so memorable, but also so formulaic. And the fact that we don't get even a hint of that in the movie Gladiator, I think is a huge, huge shame. So here I am, waiting for a real Gladiator movie to come out about real gladiators. And I'll be there in the cinema to watch it, and I'm sure lots of you will as well. Before I go, I just want to once again thank the Great Courses Plus for sponsoring this video, and they are the reason that you haven't had any other ads on this video at all. Isn't that nice? Do go and check out that link below. It's fantastic. I'm really enjoying the Great Courses Plus, and I'm going to be spending many hours watching stuff on there, and I'm very glad that I've got a membership on there now. So once again, give this video a like, share it around, subscribe to my channel if you haven't done already, and it'll be great to have you here as a new member of the community if you're new to us. And I will see you really soon again for another video. Might be about gladiators or other Roman things, might be about medieval fantasy movies, who knows. But I will see you really soon on Schola Gladiatoria channel for another video. Cheers, folks.